NATO's standoff with Russia has reached a breaking point. What began with military aid to Ukraine, sanctions, and political pressure has spiraled into drone incursions, airspace violations, and threats traded almost daily. Each move feels less like support and more like direct confrontation. In Moscow, officials are no longer speaking in whispers. They're calling it what it looks like. NATO has declared war on Russia. The only question now is how far this conflict will go. Russian officials have been escalating their narrative lately, and recently said that NATO and the European Union, through their support for Ukraine, have already declared war on Russia. In fact, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently told the UN that NATO and the EU have already declared a real war on my country through their involvement in Ukraine. Basically, their claim combines a political message with a legal argument, and it's also an attempt to invert blame. From Moscow's perspective, the problem is that Western military aid, sanctions, and direct involvement, especially in Ukraine, pretty much means that NATO is participating in a war against Russia itself. But from NATO's perspective, that claim has been mostly dismissed as distortion and propaganda. In fact, NATO maintains that it supports Ukraine, but it has not formally declared any war on Russia. The alliance is trying to show the difference between supporting a conflict and directly waging one. Still, the tensions between Russia and NATO are still rising, especially with Russia's recent actions in the Polish airspace. That's what caused NATO to launch Operation Eastern Sentry. The launch of Operation Eastern Sentry marks a major step in NATO's posture along its eastern flank. The operation was announced in September 2025 and is focusing on strengthening defense and deterrence capabilities for NATO states in response to a wave of aerial incursions and drone flights across NATO airspace. The immediate trigger to this was a notable drone incursion into Poland in early September. Some 19 to 23 drones allegedly entered Polish airspace during the night of September 9th to 10th. Poland could shoot down up to 4 drones, and then invoked Article 4 of the NATO treaty, saying that this was not just an attack on Poland, but on the entire NATO. Russia and Belarus also held Zapad 2025 drills and military exercises during the same time their drones entered Polish airspace. This was seen as a show of force and deterrence, signaling Moscow's readiness and capacity for coordinated operations with one of its closest allies. Under Eastern Sentry, NATO has mobilized assets across the land, sea, and air. For instance, the alliance has deployed F-16, Eurofighters, Rafales, and naval assets to help patrol, monitor, and deter further incursions. The logic is pretty straightforward. NATO is trying to show capability, respond to provocations, and deter escalation. But it also raises some difficult questions like, how far will NATO go in defensive posture without crossing into offensive operations? And how can Russia perceive that threshold? Well, Russia is already pushing the envelope, as the country recently did something that caused NATO to give a pretty loud reaction. One of the sharper tensions between Russia and NATO in recent days emerged when Estonia reported that 3 Russian MiG-31 jets had penetrated its airspace for about 12 minutes. Estonia called this intrusion unexpectedly brazen. Of course, NATO was very displeased with this action and publicly condemned it. NATO also added that Russia should have no doubt that the alliance would employ all necessary military and non-military tools to defend itself. Again, NATO convened its North Atlantic Council under Article 4, the same article that Poland used when Russia entered its airspace with drones. Some NATO members have also brought the idea of shooting down any violating aircraft under some rules of engagement, although they haven't decided on this, as it might cause further conflict between Russia and other Western countries. As they usually do, Russia denied the incursion. The Russian Defense Ministry asserted that the jets were over neutral waters and that they didn't enter Estonian sovereign airspace. For Russia to deny it, there's no telling whether it was deliberate or not. But NATO is quickly forming a defensive posture against Russia, not just in Estonia, Poland, and Ukraine, but in other Eastern European countries. But their reinforcements have also been placed in one unexpected place, which is Turkey. As tensions are escalating, Turkey deployed an airborne warning and control system aircraft to Lithuanian airspace as part of NATO's assurance measures. The deployment was only temporary, from September 22nd to 25th, but also significant. AWACS aircraft are pretty powerful tools. They detect low-flying aircraft or drones that ground-based radar systems may miss. Their deployment shows NATO's intent to boost surveillance and situational awareness across the Eastern Front. Turkey's move is pretty interesting, especially considering its historically complex relationship with Russia, including the energy ties and regional diplomacy. Its decision to send AWACS under NATO auspices shows that the alliance is rallying broad participation, even among countries that are still related to Moscow in some form or the other. All of these actions have been worsening the conflict between Russia and NATO. And now, NATO has publicly issued a warning to Russia. NATO's messages to Russia have grown further. In the wake of the Estonian incursion and previous drone incursions into Poland, NATO has said that it would use all NATO means, military and non-military, to defend its territory. The alliance has also held a lot of consultations, invoked treaty mechanisms, and repeatedly said that any violations of the airspace of the member states would be met with swift response. But behind the scenes, debates are still ongoing. There's one question looming, which asks, should NATO shoot down a manned Russian jet that violates alliance airspace? Some say that they probably shouldn't, except Russia actually attacks another state for no reason, because shooting a Russian military aircraft would carry massive escalation risk. Yet, even the possibility of any measures from NATO is powerful alone. It shows that NATO is definitely not bluffing, and if there are any military incursions from Russia, they never know when it provokes real consequences. NATO has made its own warnings, but so has Russia, and the powerful country has warned of decisive action. On multiple occasions, Russian officials have warned that any aggression against Russia would be met with a decisive response. At the UN General Assembly, Sergei Lavrov said exactly that. While Russia does not plan to attack NATO or Europe, it would not hesitate to respond if Russia itself were attacked. Russia has framed itself as a reactive rather than an aggressive party, saying that it's under threat from the West and not the initiator of these conflicts. Also, using the language of decisive response is pretty vague, and that allows a lot of room for escalation and deterrence. Russia has also been accusing NATO and the EU of using Ukraine as a front, basically a proxy in a broader war. Even from Lavrov's speeches alone, NATO and EU's actions have been called a direct involvement and war by proxy. If the conflict continues like this, the little country of Ukraine might be the center of a war between major powers. Even Lavrov had said that Ukraine is being used in NATO's real war on Russia. Now, Russia has been using warnings and strategic posturing to try to deter NATO from crossing some lines. For Moscow, the message is clear. Push too far, and you risk hitting response thresholds that you might have not even expected. But aside from warnings of decisive action, Russia has also made a lot of claims against NATO, starting with the fact that NATO declares war on Russia. Russia is claiming that NATO is waging a real war on Russia via Ukraine, and that Kyiv, under NATO's backing, is a front for Western assault. Moscow is also saying that NATO's troop deployments, air policing, and Eastern posture are all provocations that are meant to encircle or weaken Russia. It seems like the West is isolating Russia in Europe, which is why Russia is doing everything it can to stop Ukraine from joining NATO. Even after all the allegations of violating Estonian airspace, Russia has denied all these events and instead claimed that its aircraft flew over neutral waters. It continues to accuse NATO of having political motives and that NATO's actions themselves are provocative. Now, the tensions between NATO and Russia are sharpening over threats, denials, and accusations. One major threat centers on the Kremlin's reaction to reports that NATO might be prepared to shoot down Russian aircraft violating European airspace. There are also intelligence claims by Russia's SVR about Moldova, ahead of its elections. The Kremlin, through spokesman Dmitry Peskov, has strongly condemned talk of shooting down Russian military planes. He has described it as reckless and irresponsible, and also said that there is no credible evidence that any Russian aircraft violated NATO airspace. So to Moscow, any statements of these shootdowns are being treated as dangerous escalation. Meanwhile, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service has upped its own rhetoric regarding Moldova. Before the Moldovan parliamentary elections, the SVR claimed that NATO and the EU were preparing for a military occupation of Moldova, or at least that forces would land in the Odessa region in Ukraine. The allegations also said that troops from France and the UK are already being positioned, that logistics hubs and railways are being prepared, and that Moldova is being converted into a forward outpost in case of future Russia-NATO tensions. But on the other side, Moldovan authorities have rejected these claims, even calling them part of a hybrid war, with disinformation, propaganda, and destabilization being tools, especially since there are no confirmed troop movements. Despite all the words said by Russia, NATO is still standing on its ground. It has warned Russia against any movements, especially any sabotage, cyber attacks, assassination plots, and disinformation that is aimed at destabilizing the alliance and disrupting any aid they send to Ukraine. So, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is taking another angle. Russia is saying that Ukraine is being used as a tool to fight against them, while NATO is saying that Russia is meddling in the affairs of Eastern European states. At this point, there's no formal war declaration by NATO against Russia, and we might not see one in the near term, especially since this might lead to global conflict. But the styles of war with messaging, probing, deterrence, escalation, and counter-escalation are very much obvious. The real question now is, how far can each side push without crossing the line into an open, declared conflict? Let's know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date on global military events.